the issue of leadership, and ended with a controversial showing of Lollapalooza. We will talk through several subsequent sections about that. I mean, the linkage between arts, culture, consumption, entertainment, public policy supporting this, and then migration. And the migration part is a critical piece of this, which I'll talk about more today, as it's a link here with the sections on leadership and this next section on markets. But again, we have the Chicago case, one case. If we have something like one case is growing dramatically in the number of 25 to 34-year-olds, we have the open question of why? What's the driver? And if you interview lots of people, you can get lots of answers. How can we deal with the related leadership hypothesis of invisible versus dynamic? So I put on the board arrows leading into policy outputs, elected officials, political leaders, sort of civic and other non-elected, and then various citizen characteristics here. The critical path is A in terms of the issue of, well, I say both, A and B, versus, we'll call this time C. C is the direct effect. Okay, so this is abstract, so let's slow down a second. The issue here is, how do we measure, how do we think of and then interpret whether what a mayor says drives the policy or not? It might be that it goes this way, or it might be that it goes this way. That is, it may be that, and a policy output can be a smile to a camera, it can be a raised fist, or it can be raising or lowering taxes. These are all policy outputs, some more symbolic, some more material, some big, some small. But what a city did, or what the so-called track record of an official is often the main, or one main thing that elected officials who do have a track record run on. They say, look at what I've done for Chicago, re-elect me as alderman or neighbor or school board member or mayor. And that would be this C, this would be path D, and here's path E. Alternatively, people may move out of the city or leave a neighborhood or move into another neighborhood. The city of Chicago has some old steel mills on the far south side which have lost large quantities of their population. They were blue-collar steel workers. When the steel mills closed, some of them found other jobs, many did not, many left. Some of them have been traced and followed, others not. So, but the point is, and this, I wouldn't say this is necessarily, by no means is it necessarily a policy output of an explicit desired government policy. It's substantially more interglobal, international, economic aspects of where can steel be produced inexpensively, how much investment is there in new high tech, and basically the American steel industry underinvested and the high tech went abroad. So the whole American steel industry collapsed, as it did in Western Europe, but also elsewhere. But second, there was a decline in general industry and demand for steel. So without going into that in too much detail, I'm making the point that feedback here is important. And the bottom line, one bottom line for purposes of linking between markets and leadership is how strong is this arrow Okay, so if we have a statement, or say Toni Preckwinkle, when she was president, she was president of Cook County Board a year ago before the mayoral election. There was a hot issue which she was involved with. Most of you are not from Chicago, so probably don't know about it. But it was, how much, or can we deal with one of the biggest problems of especially middle and lower income African Americans, not just African Americans, but the whole Western world is obese, getting fatter. And one thing which has been blamed is things like cola drinks, Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, and so forth, is having too much sugar and too many things which make you feel you want to have more of it, some people maintain. So Toni Preckwinkle's proposal was to increase a tax on cola drinks, and it was implemented. And there was a huge reaction against it, saying, I got to have Pepsi-Cola. I need my drink all the time. And she got a lot of flack for that. So that's an example. Raising a tax. D is getting flack. It leading her to say, this is what you need for good health. I know that you don't want to pay more. I know that you like it, but it is killing you. You're getting too fat. Change your drinking habits, and the tax will try to help you do that. She said that she was right in terms of health. She was wrong in terms of politics. It made her much less popular, and in the last election, people said she's assured. She had twice as much support in the last election. She did not run for mayor, but Rahm Emanuel was running. He had so little support. Toni Preckwinkle, the Sun-Times did a poll which said Toni Preckwinkle would have twice as many votes if she ran for mayor, but she didn't. Then, 4 years later, she did. She lost. Okay, so the feedback to an issue like that is clearly part of a concern of, it's a major concern of political leaders, who many of whom want to be reelected. And one issue then is, how much do they anticipate that the policy might be favorably supported or not? And so we get to Downs's discussion of complete information. How much information do we have? Most of the time we have certainly less than complete. It may be 10%, it may be 50%, but we often don't know what's in the heads or how strongly the emotional or the other reactions may be of citizens, obese kids who like cola, their parents, how this is covered by the media. There are many things of chance combinations which are unpredictable in any deterministic way. One way, which I briefly presented last time, was to look at how strong is this if we compare, say, the mayor's policy statement. So we have data. We collected data twice across all U.S. cities, over 25,000. We asked all the mayors and all the council members, what's your policy on general taxation, and then specifically services like schools, police, fire, and so forth? Would you like to spend more, spend less, or stay about the same? And with that, we created a measure, and then we weighted it by the power of the mayor, measured both by formal appointment authority and informal, sort of whether there's a political machine which is backing you, or whether you've got a strong support in the city council, various ways. And basically we found if you have stronger high spending preferences and you have more power as measured in this way, this A path was, remember what I said last time? Is it strong, weak, 0, mixed? Why and when is it mixed? Okay, depends on the city, but if we have in this sort of analysis, if we have all the U.S. cities, over 25,000, we're studying all that population of cities, at least all the mayors who answer the question. And the bottom line was that in the late 60s, when these debates were going on, and then in the years after those new mayors and councils were elected or re-elected or not, there was a big increase in spending from 1970 to 74, and this path was significant and strong, as was Path B, which was those groups that tended to favor higher spending. This was the 1970 to 74 period, whereas before that, Path A and B were almost insignificant, and afterward they were almost insignificant. That's a measure of a concept that we talked about last time, which was what kind of leadership? Two kinds of leadership by contrast. Anybody remember?
Dynamic and invisible.
There we go. Dynamic and invisible. Two kinds of leadership. So if the path is 0 in significance, then we have invisible leadership, which is to say, of course, the city has a budget, it makes appointments, it raises taxes, but if the mayor simply goes around, Mayor Abraham Beam, Mayor Koch, who beat Beam in New York after the New York fiscal crisis. Koch had the style of going into the New York subways and walking from person to person and said, "How am I doing? How am I doing?" Ronald Reagan was the first president to do polls every single night of his presidency. They just had a short question. How's the president doing today? Good, bad, so forth. And his advisors would see that Reagan was very popular on his low spending policies. He was super unpopular when he talked about his social issues of school prayer and related issues, the social issues that he made himself famous for. He was way out to the right of most American citizens, but he was at the center, and so on the fiscal issues. So his advisor said, "Talk about money, talk about taxes. Don't say anything about your social programs." But he didn't do it, and he had problems. Okay, but the point is, if you just say the same thing as what previous mayors and previous presidents have said, and you agree with your party, and you agree with the council, and you agree with citizens, you will be invisible. People won't say, "This is a Reagan policy," or "This is a Trump policy." They'll say, or it may be, so if we go back to Daily One, this is the most studied city in the world. And this is a key issue. How important is the mayor? So a bestseller book was written by a Chicago journalist, Mike Royko, called Boss. And it was and is a bestseller. Many people say, "Look at Boss, and you can see he was super powerful. He did this, he did that, he got everything he wanted." He got a lot of what he wanted because he didn't try. Guess there's another book, Edward Banfield's book called Political Influence. His main argument is Daily One got a lot because he only asked after issues were fought over, and he would then say, "Okay, here's the winner. I'll hold up his hand, and that's my position. And I'm powerful because I'm doing what people want." Okay. Very different interpretations, but basically a third book on the style of leadership was by Milton Rakoff, UIC professor. And his was based on not only the mayor, but a leading city council member who'd been in Chicago for years. He said, "What's your secret? How have you governed for so long, so successfully?" He said, "I just have two things I do. Don't make no waves, don't back no losers." Okay, don't make no waves means be invisible. Don't do things which make waves. Toni Preckwinkle made a lot of waves and she lost. Okay, Daily wouldn't have done that. Daily One, and Daily Two was often cautious on big policies. He made some big policy decisions, but he invisible versus dynamic. Hard to capture. We can look for more subtle things. And if we have different policy areas, we can look at how they work. Okay. We talked about a reading which we struggled to put online and found it was already online if you click in the right way. Anybody want to comment on what the take is on this from Paul Peterson? What did he have to say? Anybody look at the reading? Yeah.
I know he talks about different types of.
Just a little louder, please.
He talks about different types of policy, like redistributive.
Three kinds of important, yeah, critical point. So tell us a little more. Three kinds of policies.
There's redistributive.
Redistributive.
The one that's neutral.
Allocational.
And the one that's about development.
Developmental. Three kinds of policy. Good. What's the point of that? Why is this important? In terms of dynamic and invisible leadership. Is the mayor important in general in all of these? Because the book is a general, it's an essay. It's really a quasi-conceptual essay about leadership, especially in the U.S., but around the world as well. Okay, that's the hard question. I taught a workshop seminar with him when he had the book in draft, and we had a book, City Money, in draft, and we had a chapter from each book each week, and one then next, and we alternated and discussed and argued. We had several assistants who were working with us on it because it was quite a scene. Ken Wong, his top student, made a more later. Wrote a more subtle and nuanced version in his book called City Choices, and then Wong was here on the faculty for 10 years or so. Peterson basically said the structure of these issue areas heavily influences, if not determines, what the mayor and local leaders do. The basic argument, to simplify, is that developmental, three issues. That the first, developmental, tends to be consensual and more dominated by business and civic leaders, as it is focused on bringing in outside capital, keeping a smiling face on all participants who may benefit from growth. And Peterson argued that this is a major moving force of cities, driven by the more general logic of capitalist growth, which city government seek to maximize as it increases the land value of the locality. This is a major simplifying assumption for Peterson that many others have criticized. By contrast, we'll come back. By contrast, allocational decisions like which neighborhood gets the police and fire faster response and the location of firehouses and so forth, which tends to pit one neighborhood, one group within the city against each other. And this is the normal group processes and political dynamics that Dahl talked about, whereas Hunter might be linked more to the business dominance view in the developmental arena. So in a sense, this is one way of trying to deal with that conflict. The third is redistributive decisions, which Peterson essentially argues is suicidal for local governments to pursue at all, since they will simply lead to attracting the poor and driving out the rich. So how can we have redistribution and in a country or in cities? What's he say here? He says basically it can't be done. He sent a draft of the book to Aaron Vildovsky, who's a very smart, probably a top political scientist at the time, who sent back in one sentence, what about New York? New York has done a lot of redistributive politics for much of the 20th century. It changed a lot in the Depression. New York basically quasi went bankrupt in the 1930s, and again in the New York fiscal crisis, 1973, 75. New York basically couldn't borrow, couldn't pay its debt, etc., and went into receivership. It got bailed out by the national government. In those periods, New York was forced to cut back on its redistribution. But New York often did this, as it has had classically a left, liberal, higher spending constituency for the mayor, and the mayor's tried to do that. But the fact that in bad times economically, New York City has basically been unable to continue those policies illustrates the degree to which other groups are important. I was at the Brookings Institution at the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington the summer of the New York fiscal crisis, and I was and at that point, New York officials and the New York Times and others were coming. They were lobbying. They were doing everything they could to get the federal government to say, "We'd just like to have $3 billion, please, 2.5, $3 billion, and that will cover our debts. Then we'll be able to continue." And so there was a headline in the New York Post which said, New York City dropped dead after the president and the national government said no money. So that the city, the media were proud. They wanted to continue their policies, but they did so. And I went to a number of meetings held by the United States Conference of Mayors, for instance, and other related groups. And you would have the director of finances or an assistant mayor come and talk to 50, 100 other mayors. They would say literally, just an example to show here, we're moving into now policy, feedback, and competition among cities. The top New York officials would say, we really need to have the support from the federal government because we've been putting on the Nutcracker Suite as a ballet for 50 years, and we have reserved seats where we let a large number of the low-income kids in New York schools come and watch the ballet so they have a feel for this art. It's expensive, but we're paying for that, and the risk is we won't be able to continue this policy if we don't get the $2.5 billion. Is that a persuasive argument to 50 mayors? Black mayor put up his finger and said, we don't have an opera, we don't have a ballet, we don't have many movie houses, and we can't support any of those. Are you sure that you want $3.5 billion? Excellent. So that is this was not a very smart way of trying to persuade other cities to support you in lobbying nationally for this kind of policy. But the top New York officials didn't even realize that they should make a different kind of argument than what I just quoted to you. Okay. I mean, I was amazed when I saw this. Okay. But I'm pointing to this as in a sense of it showed the degree to which there was a feeling among political leaders, civic leaders in New York Times that this was obvious. We should be doing this. Okay. Two quick examples, Boston and San Francisco. Both had mayors, both were strong, fiscally liberal. They wanted to help the disadvantaged. And one mayor did so for a year or two, and then he lost office, and then he went to MIT for a couple of years. He had an office next to a very smart urban analyst, modeling computer guy. And so they talked for a year, and the computer analyst did a model of tried to say, what if we have different kinds of policies which may feedback over different time periods and different scenarios of how far the policy is from the preferences of the majority of citizens, so you could have E and E, especially E. And basically his story was Peterson's story. If you raise taxes a lot, you will drive out the people who have the money to pay the taxes. The mayor became convinced of it, and he ran, and he was elected, and Boston changed its policies. San Francisco, famous book called Left Coast City. Left Coast City, San Francisco had a policy for the homeless. We want to help the homeless. These are disadvantaged people, they're visibly troubled. We will provide food, we'll provide social assistance, we'll provide health, and so forth. And they did it much more generously than other cities in the whole U.S. So did Washington for a while, Washington, D.C. After about a year, both Washington, D.C. and San Francisco said, or they noticed the number of homeless people got bigger and bigger and bigger. And there were stories, at least, that there were local governments in Utah, Nevada, Wyoming, which would give a one-way ticket, bus ticket, to San Francisco to the homeless people in their towns. One-way bus ticket to San Francisco. Bye-bye. San Francisco will be more generous than we can help here in Cheyenne. And so the numbers of homeless are still much larger in San Francisco. And so basically the story is the whole book is just on that policy, basically. And it shows that the mayor stopped the policy but it took about 2 years because San Francisco was and still is highly socially liberal and tried to be fiscally liberal. It didn't frame it in terms of redistribution. It framed it more in terms of helping the disadvantaged, giving everyone equal access to, etc. There's a book on the homeless in Los Angeles by Forrest Stewart, which we'll talk about later on as we proceed. I mentioned it briefly last time. But the politics of how homeless and others feed into this and use the symbolism is important. That is, it's not only the specific implementation of a policy, but how you talk about it. That is also critical. And so if we look at sort of critical policy discussions, we can find dramatic extreme cases. One of the most visible was in the late 19th century. That is, in Dahl's book, Who Governs, he has a section on history and basically argues that the New Haven politics was more consensual through the mid-19th century when people were more homogeneous. That is, most everyone was white, English, Protestant, middle-class background in lifestyle and thinking and policy preferences. In the later half of the 19th century, you had large numbers of Italians, Irish, were the two largest immigrant groups in New Haven. Here in Chicago, we had a much more large and diverse set of immigrants, Eastern Europe, Poland, etc. But in New England, in Boston, New Haven, especially Italians. But the point was, these were new voters who wanted new policies that seriously conflicted with the older group which was there. And when Tocqueville wrote about this, as did Dahl, they basically made the point that the older WASP elite simply tended to withdraw they stopped voting, they moved to suburbs often. So the suburban migration was illustrated in that case as a follow-up. There's a woman who's a sociologist at Northwestern, did a PhD on the general policy, not just New Haven, but how much in the late 19th century, as you had New York, Boston, New Haven, Hartford, the bigger New England cities were taken over, quote unquote, where that is, the political numbers were such that the majority of the voters were no longer the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But they were in suburbs and small towns. So you had conflicts, big conflicts then between the state level politics, Massachusetts, New York, and the locals. And so the state still had a more traditional ethnic and income majority, and they tried to constrain the policies at the state level, at the state level as they affected local spending, etc., in ways that we had clear, open conflicts among these. Gabriel Allman did his PhD on this within New York City and at the state level, and how they went back and forth between civic groups attacking the new policies, fighting the machine, corruption, etc. But one big obvious corollary was many middle and upper status persons moved out of central cities, and they moved to what were then created as new towns made possible by railroads and the new car, the automobile, which made commuting to lots of little suburban towns technically easy and inexpensive compared to what had been in the past. And these grew. Secondly, there were schools, private schools, both locally and in the whole New England area, that attracted more socially and economically advantaged persons who explicitly, and the schools were created in part, and they had students who went there because the families and the kids did not want to be in the public schools of Boston or New York. Okay, so these clear local differences led to then books on, as well, Philadelphia. There's a famous book on New York called 1400 Governments by Robert Wood. There's a book on Philadelphia, of how the suburbs then would compete in turn with one another. That is, you don't just have one suburban style. There are lots of different kinds of suburbs that do. Some have golf courses and low taxes. Some have excellent schools and high taxes. Some have mixtures of this or that amenity, etc. And competition among, especially these localities and suburbs, I'm stressing here, but between the suburbs and the central cities, between whole regions, are a clear critical dynamic which illustrating path E. And the guy who developed this is T-I-E-B-O-U-T. Charles Thibault was an assistant professor here, then at Northwestern, and at Northwestern he really looked at this in the Chicago area, but he theorized about it in ways that brought in the bigger theories, and he's the person who's the main theorist stressing competition among local governments or localities, especially as articulated by their local governments, in response to where citizens may and do move is critical. And so this in turn informed, this is the background, this is the main background idea of Peterson. Peterson took the idea from Thibault. It's not Peterson's original idea. And this is classic so-called public choice. It's straight out of competition economics. If you, however, look into economic theories and empirical work, how do the economists know when a market is competitive or not? It's hard. The whole area of trust, antitrust, competition, regulation, of which has been led here at the University of Chicago and the lead person for 40, 50 years was Edward Levy, who was dean of the law school. He wrote books on this, and the administration building right across the street from us is called the Edward Levy Hall. He was a brilliant president, but he also this was his arena, and there were a number of people who were hired and promoted who worked on exactly this, and made major decisions over Microsoft, over General Motors, etc., where you have gray areas. But the bottom line is, how do you know when can you find competition and try to say it's higher or it's lower? And the bottom line is it's very hard, whether you're dealing with corporations or governments. And so you have things like size, what the share of the market. If you have one firm that has 50% or 80% of the market, people may say, well, that's a monopoly. but is it implementing monopolistic practices or not, and how do you measure that? And the biggest example right now in the press are the big tech companies, Google, etc., Apple, and you can see this being argued and fought over nationally and internationally. China is part of this as well, and the point of adding China is that it's complicated because we're not dealing with, in this example, and I'm getting to this here, nationally. That is, it's not just local. It's between locals. It's national, but then it's global. It's international because Samsung, Chinese computer firms are in competition with Apple and with others. And how much do we find that governments are changing the rules of the game to help or shift the ways in which there is competition, global, nationally, for one firm or for another? So I will simply say that these kinds of debates have been going on and inform this whole field up to present, and simply make the point that many people feel that is one way, such as gone into in detail with Lefkoe City, is that if you see big policy shifts of helping the homeless more people migrating, that seems to be evidence that the policy makes a difference. But then, if they then cut back, how much does that change the migration? Okay, so clearly it depends on, and we're dealing in a sense with less than pure competition and imperfect information. But that's an economic concept. Imperfect information covers most of sociology and political science, in the sense that it says how do parties work, how do the media work, how do civic groups work, how do citizens get their information, how which of them lobby and how much, and then as we have turnout, which can go from 5% to 100%, how much does turnout transform these dynamics? And I'm making the point, followed by a former teaching assistant in this course, that the turnout can transform a whole lot, including the biggest turnout was when we had a new black mayor for the first time. A man who was black was running for office, and this happened for the first two major cases were Gary, Indiana, and Detroit, and they had two black mayors in the early 70s, Coleman Young and Richard Hatcher, who were very charismatic and very successful and made a huge visible impact. Huge turnout, that is, as African American voters got more and more engaged and they went to the polls, so did their opponents. Same thing happened with Chicago, and you had famous Eddie Verdoliak, who was running for office against Harold Washington. And when Harold Washington was first running, Fast Eddie Verdoliak said, vote for Fast Eddie before it's too late. Okay, so pretty open rhetorical attacks on ethnic transition. The interesting story by Zoli Heinl, former teaching assistant here, was that in the next election in Detroit or Gary, or the third election, 1-2 elections after you have this kind of racial polarization and huge increase in turnout, after a couple of elections, it goes back to normal pretty fast. And in various ways that you can have, and I ride my bike a lot. I'd ride from home down to here. I'd get thrown stones at. I could tell, when things were tougher with mayoral elections and other stuff going on. Other times, we had a tour with us, a bunch of people going. We called it Icons of Black Power. Went through all black neighborhoods basically. Some people say, "Hey, how you doing?" They would wave in a friendly way. That changes as these things shift. Okay, so Heinel has measured this systematically with turnout, with surveys, with policies, and the like. Okay, let me then push on to the next step. The next step is the global. Let me feed into that. Yeah, I made this point that this became zero. When we then repeated this analysis in these different time periods, early 60s, late 70s, then when we added new data after the book was out, we done this continually up to present. Basically, in this period, middle period, many of these local processes were significant. Unions had an impact. Civic groups had an impact. Political leaders had an impact. Many of the individual other groups mattered. That is, they had an impact on specific types of spending and the like in clear, visible ways. This, of course, this is using multiple regression, ordinary least squares for the whole U.S. So this is the national average. It's not the story for every individual city, which may be above or below a national average. But this was the overall story, that these mattered in this time period. But in the next years, in the first time around, only at percent African American and other intergovernmental grants, IGR, remain significant when all these other local leadership things fell to zero. The next time period, race became insignificant, and the next time period, grants became insignificant as they've dried up. They used to be big and they used to be differentiated among cities. So you have, what's going on? Peterson is probably more right than he was when we were having our seminar. I was arguing with him. Okay, at least many people will say we live in a more global world today than we did 20, 30 years ago. And I would say it's not a question of the world. The question is, how is it in individual countries and in individual cities? And I'll come back to that. But let's join the theory. The theory is one of the main theories, at least in the academic world. Saskia Sassen was an important contributor to the theory. She doesn't cite almost anybody theoretically. She just said this is the way things happen in global cities. She uses Marx, she uses Adam Smith, she uses competition, she uses hierarchy. She puts them all together. So parts of her argument come right from Marx, from Lenin. Other parts come from Adam Smith. She doesn't make any of this explicit, as I say, but here are some of her main points. And let me...
Who is that?
Saskia, I'll put her name up here. Saskia Sassen, S-A-S-S-E-N, Dutch name. Try not to make it easier so you don't need to shift everything. So I'll put this here. She was here for almost 10 years or so, and she and I taught several courses. Okay. Her basic argument is that globalization leads to inequality. And she cites New York City as her lead example. That is, she has most of her evidence come from 3 case studies: London, New York, and Tokyo. which she cites as the quintessential global cities in the world. And so this is model one. Model two, sorry, let me introduce briefly a little bit more. This argument, in a sense, is an extension of Karl Marx, that we have more class conflict, we have more political disagreement, we have more inequality of income, as we have more globalization. Lenin Marx didn't write that much. Lenin was the main person who wrote about this from a Marxist perspective. Model two is a globalization may lead to inequality, but that in turn leads to new policies, that it leads to feedback which says, let's change the policy. And that in a sense could be left coast city. That is, the homeless come, you say, okay, let's not do that so much. Okay. That can happen, and she doesn't really talk about that. That is, there's almost no, I mentioned there are multiple theories, but there's almost nothing about government in the Global City book. And I argued with her about this continually. She has in her later book, she has a lot of discussion, especially of some national government policies in some areas, but she basically is not interested in government specific very much. And takes it far. Okay, so what I'm bringing in here is how and why government can really make a difference. So model 3 is globalization, A and B here, can lead either to inequality or inequality related, let's say inequality related policies, and anti inequality kinds of policies in path A or path B. But we can also add model 4, which is that there may be other variables also leading A, B, C here, also driving these policies, which are not just the government policies, such as what's happening in other cities. And so the A is the classic sort of left political party, whereas, A would be the more conservative, traditional market-oriented, stress the market party. B is the anti-market party, more left, more helping the disadvantaged. Okay, so that's the overall framework, which is basically to say there are 4 options, and which of these happen is an empirical question. Yeah.
So the fourth model is that there are other variables besides globalization that are leading to inequality policies and anti-inequality policies?
Yes.
Okay.
And that these may be direct effect, or they may in turn shift this kind of discussion.
And does she elaborate on what these other things are?
She says almost nothing about 2, 3, or 4 in the book. That's what she and I argued about. However, we had a lot of smart students, and there was looking for here. Is it Jae-Suk Sun? Kathleen Fernicola helped to rewrite the book. I'm looking here. One of them did an MA, and she was working simultaneously with some economists. She took the best model she could find on inequality and growth of wages in different models from economics. So she tried to measure the other variables systematically by drawing on the best literature, basically. Then she added the three specific policies linked to globalization, or at least measures linked to it. When we say what's globalization, and the three were percent immigrant residents or percent immigrant workers, percent immigrants in the city, foreign direct investment, and in the area, local area, and, producer services. What are producer services? Standard economic concept. She didn't invent this. She simply said these are critical in driving the policy. Nobody knows. Okay, producer services are things like accounting and law firms, and they mainly sell their services to producers like big banks or big governments. Or if you're thinking, and if you're General Motors, you can ask a law firm and you can ask a financial accounting firm to say, if we want to move, if we want to build a factory in three different countries, which country should we build in, and why, and how much would we pay in taxes, how much would it cost, and how much more would we potentially earn if we went to South Korea or Morocco or Mexico. And so they're companies now, especially in New York and Chicago, that say, we have lawyers who cover 120 countries around the world. If you want to do things globally, come to us. So these are producer services with a global focus. And one thing which Sasson shows in a revised version of the book is these are the people who really made more money with more globalization. They serve the Wall Street, they're part of the Wall Street investment discussion. And the related point is that because they're there nearby Wall Street, they talk face to face with brokers, with investors, with hedge funds, and they try to lobby and say, let's do this, or here's what it will cost. And the presence and the numbers of these lead to more inequality in New York, is her argument. Take a look at her chapter called Consumption, and you will see it has nothing to do about taste. It has to do, if you're working on Wall Street, you got to have a chauffeur, you got to have a nanny, you got to have people who come and iron your clothes, and you have to have special croissant of this sort and that. That is, you have no choice. It's what you have to do. Okay. But the point is, it leads to inequality because then New York experiences more in-migration of chauffeurs and nannies and people who bake the croissant. That's her argument, to simplify. She then discusses other cities, and basically, if you're a less but even within New York, not everybody gets rich. It's the people who work in those occupations where they have more global customers. That's her argument as to why producer services not only get paid more, but why they in turn enhance the degree of global activities, and with their higher lifestyle of funds, attract lower status persons, and that in turn increases the inequality. Because the lower status persons are not dealing with as big a market, and therefore their incomes don't go up the way they do if you're working in that part of Wall Street. Okay, so the last part, is this Marx? No, this is pure Adam Smith. Adam Smith basically said, if you have more competition, or that is, let me ask you, what's the first chapter of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations? We got 20 economists here, you're not all here today. But anybody who's read Adam Smith in economics, and this is first week of Economics 101. Why? What's the source of the wealth of nations? What drives the wealth? You guys are smiling. You're economic majors? Okay. Anybody else can answer? Okay. Simple, quick answer is, yeah.
Division of labor.
Yes, division of labor, absolutely. But what drives, we're getting close, what drives the division of labor? what that is, can you have a lot of division of labor in a small town, or or for one farmer with one farm? No. So what leads to the division of labor in his first chapter?
Like a lot of people be together.
Yes, but and what's his economic label for that? Trade? Yes, but why is there more trade? Okay, his concept is the extent of the market. So what Adam Smith called the extent of the market is what Sasson and people today call globalization. So as we have markets that move from just Wall Street or just selling hot dogs nearby, and they move to New Jersey, then they move to California, then they move to China, and China in turn was a heavy export-driven economy, exporting. This is a bigger extent of the market, and it leads to more wealth for everyone, as Adam Smith is. Okay, Sasson in that part of the argument is directly Adam Smith. So she joins Marx. Marx is concerned with inequality, with Adam Smith's ideas of competition. And so they're both at work here in a useful way. At least it's a useful hypothesis. All right, so then along came the MA student who said, okay, these are three nice case studies. Even within the case studies, there were papers, and I'll hold one up here, called Why Sasson is Wrong, a response to burgers, written by a guy named Chris Hamnett, who spent several years, he's a London economic geographer who I've been at conferences with. And his basic argument is that Sasson may be pretty much right for New York, but she's wrong for London. And his basic argument is that number 3 and number 4 are going on. That because people in London, well, they're conscious of this, but the people in London basically, that England has a stronger welfare state than the U.S. Nationally, and specifically within London, there are a number of specific policies which reduce any income inequality compared to New York and to the U.S. However, in the European context, England still has more income inequality than does, the other extreme is France. So France than the East Europeans, like Poland. They, under the Russians, had a stronger focus on equality of income. And so you have substantial differences in income inequality, but they can be modeled and analyzed. And so Berger's basic argument is, if you have a set of government taxation, redistributive kinds of policies which prevent this sort of inequality growing, then you don't have Sasson's processes work. So Sasson is wrong, was her argument. Okay. He and I were then on a PhD committee of a student in the Netherlands, Jeroen van der Waal, and we had great discussions, and then I gave some talks in London, and we went over these issues. But basically, the two students, Jeroen van der Waal in the Netherlands and the Chinese woman here who did her MA, basically found that Sasson is wrong. And Sasson was right, at least if we call this, we have 3 tests. She was wrong for producer services. She was at least right in terms of there was a clear positive association between foreign direct investment in a city. This is now all U.S. metropolitan areas. So that she had data which required metro areas. So these are all the metro areas in the U.S. Maybe I forgot, maybe 800 of them, something like that. And then percent immigrant workers. So the comparison. So the more immigrant workers there were, the more income inequality there was. So in that sense, so Sasson, a Sasson supporter, could say, well, Sasson was right on 2, but this was her original argument, that these things tend to work through the producer services. And so, anyway, so Jeroen van der Waal, so that was the U.S. analysis. And I managed to gently persuade, and we got it published, and we have 3 this Chinese student is the first author. I'm the second co-author, and Sassen is the third co-author. So it's published with her name on it, but showing that we had this finding. Jeroen van der Walle has a book which is out, and he basically he was devastatingly critical of Sassen, going over all kinds of stuff. That's the first part. The second part, he said, what might be the drivers of inequality? And he goes through producer services in detail, and he basically argues that this is not going to work the way she's hypothesized. The third section is that he brings in ethnic tolerance. And in general, the Dutch are very tolerant. I mean, they're Calvinists. They've been so for hundreds of years, etc. You don't have at a very low level the kind of open, nasty political attacks based on race and ethnicity that you do in France, that you do in Austria, that you do in especially Eastern Europe. However, the Dutch do differ. So he did surveys in many of the Dutch cities and got enough of these that did a multiple regression. And he found when he tried to look at what caused income inequality, producer services were insignificant. Education mattered a bit, but the thing that was most important was, and answers to question, how much are you? Was sort of, do people on the job that you have seen in your experience treated equally if they're immigrants or Dutch persons? And those cities where more people said the immigrants are not treated the same as the Dutch tended to have more income inequality between the immigrants and lower status persons than the ones than in the towns where they said they're treated about more equally, then the income differences were smaller. Okay, so his basic argument was, this is spurious because other things matter more, and one big variable that Sassen left out was treatment of immigrants. Okay, and we see this, maybe it sounds obvious, but at the time she was writing it, we didn't have any of this stuff going on with Trump in the US. The Europeans did. I mean, the Europeans have been more shocked by immigration. There've been little Trumps in Europe like Trump, little Trumps for 20 years. I mean, the French and the Austrians were the most obvious. Okay. Okay. Let's have discussion. Anything's fair game. You scratching the back of your head?
There's one thing I was wondering. So we spoke a bit about the dynamic and the invisible leadership before, but it wasn't really clear which one was better of the examples that you mentioned.
Yeah, I wouldn't say one is better or worse. I mean, if you're a Donald Trump, you may have a personality which says, I want to be very dynamic. He says he's dynamic all the time. If you go conversely, and many Western European American political leaders are something in that direction. By contrast, if you go to Switzerland, the political ideal is consensus. And a good political leader, especially in the smaller towns and the German areas, have no visibility. And that's what they want, and they're reelected in those terms. And they explicitly say, we are here to serve the citizens. So I mean, the populist, citizen-driven aspects of there is no national government in Switzerland. It's a confederation of provinces, basically. And these communal organizations, very weak, highly differentiated between the Germans, the German, the French, and the Italian-speaking Swiss. But one of the most heavily visited pavilions I think it's in Zurich, of symbols of Swiss national identity, are a little house in a village which is just the way the people lived as farmers, and where the government is responsive to these kinds of concerns. So it's and so in that sense, if you want to be, and the main exception is Geneva. Geneva is closer to the French model. The mayor of Geneva and the Geneva government does have stronger visible policies. But in general, the Germans and the small towns, the opposite. And they're proud of it. They campaign on it and so forth. And if they do have disagreements, they have more referenda in Switzerland than any other country in the world, and in a serious way. I mean, they may have 6 referenda in one budget period because there were disagreements on a series of things. That is, they go back. That is, no one leader will say, "I want to do this." They'll say, "Well, if we disagree, we'll go to the citizens." This also completely, I won't say completely, but it heavily weakens the importance of both the leaders and the civic groups. That they have unions, they have taxpayer groups, they have citizen groups, they have neighborhood associations. They're all there, but they're not so important because they all say, if we disagree, we'll go back and we'll call a referendum. Okay. Yes.
You talked about migration to the suburbs.
Why don't we start to get to know each other a little bit? You're from London?
No, I'm from Belgium.
No, but the fellow in the front.
Sweden.
Sweden. Oh, okay. I'm confusing you. Apologies.
Yeah.
But where in Sweden?
Stockholm.
Stockholm. Okay. Yeah. Where are you from?
Brussels.
Brussels. Okay, great. So it's good we're getting some international discussion. Go ahead.
So you talked about how people migrated into the suburbs earlier in the section, and I was wondering if there was a difference between like young wealthy people and older wealthy people. Did they all migrate into the suburbs, or was there a difference between the two, like depending on age, not just income?
Now, the main research on this, which has been done for much of the 20th century, shows it's mostly parents with school-age children. So people may say they love the central city, but when their kids are going to go to school, they move to the suburbs. When the kids are 6 or 7, then they move. And then many of them, and so this is now a bigger question. What proportion of them stay there after their children go away to college? And the classic pattern in the 50s and 60s was they stayed there. The change in the 90s and around 2000 and so forth is the high proportion of these childless parents who are moving back to downtowns, and because that is their consumers. They're getting closer to retirement, but they're not held down by their children or what they conceive of as, quote, better schools. So, I mean, that's the quick, simple answer. I mean, are there different? I mean, on the other hand, there's some parents who live in Greenwich Village in New York, who live in, who are artists and others, bohemians, and who say, I want my children to be. I mean, there are USC faculty who say, who have kids who may go to the laboratory school here, or they may go to Chicago public schools, and they may go to both, to see the differences and to have a sense of how these differences are working out. So it's not as if everyone does, and how much and where. And this was more visibly, it was more visible, say, in the end of the 19th century, and then in the 50s, let's say, when there was, again, an explosion of suburbanization and a big growth of children. But as I say, it became more visible again with the transformation of central city living, diversity, consumption, amenities, scenes, etc. has led to the but again, this varies with size of city, the specific policies of both the suburbs and the central city. And within the city of Chicago, we have both. That is, we have old neighborhoods like the steel mills, which have been devastated. The near north side, in many of these areas, have doubled in the number of residents, doubled in rent and land value in the last 10 or 15 years. And so we have huge increases in popular neighborhoods within Chicago. Yeah.
So to begin that, like for example, I'm from Boston, so Mayor Menino, like one of the things he was really focused on was kind of growing those neighborhoods within cities. Would you say that, having that kind of position as a mayor or a leader, a political leader in a city, is always valuable, and does that kind of always lead to, I guess, that economic growth in the city, establishing kind of more positions in those neighborhoods, and understanding that a city is kind of like a neighborhood in many ways?
Many will say city is like a neighborhood. Jane Byrne used to say, it's proper that that you should vote for me as a woman, because a city is like a household. It's, you got to clean, you got to take the garbage out, so forth. It's a woman's job. Okay. So in a sense, she's being halfway humorous, but in the sense of a simple ideal, yes, for sure. But when you get to specifics and subtlety, and so Boston, for instance, has what they call, or had, so-called little city halls in different neighborhoods. Boston also had some of the toughest, most difficult racial conflicts within the city, between the traditional Irish areas and African American areas in the 70s and 80s. We had several PhDs and books published about that. And so where and how to deal with potentially, and so Peterson's quick answer was, of course, these are over the allocational policies. So his answer was, if you talk more, for instance, as mayor, don't talk about those things where the question is who gets the fire department location of a new housing, and who gets the jobs. Those are the allocational conflictual decisions. And here is one way that in Chicago the issue was. This was called, under Harold Washington, Beirut on the Lake. And when Daley II came in, he successfully created new issues that transformed it away from the standard ethnic conflict, racial confrontation, which were the arts. Lollapalooza was a political policy. We'll have more on that, but I'll just leave it there for now. One last question, comment. We have one expert here on Detroit who's she's looking at her notes. Want to comment on any of this stuff? I was looking at some Coleman Young speech. I was trying to get a Coleman Young speech that would bring some of this out explicitly. How about the suburbs of Detroit compared to the central city and the state?
I think, like, with the context of comparing Chicago and Detroit, when Detroit's, like, when the auto industry started to decline in Detroit, I feel like people moved from the center of the city out to the suburbs, and so they became cities of their own. But Chicago's a little different because the city just expanded and got bigger, and then the suburbs kind of created, I don't know, it's a different ecosystem, the way in which they interact with each other. So, like, people who live in the suburbs of Detroit still interact with the city a lot more than I think people here in Chicago do, because it's still very connected. But here it feels like the city center is the city, and then the suburbs are places of their own. So, I don't know, it's a little different. Okay,
well, Detroit remains highly controversial and is used for many different arguments, but let's read on, and we will continue this discussion on Monday, and we'll go from there.